It's June 6th, 1944, and Adolf Hitler is sleeping. His staff won't wake him because he's given strict orders not to be disturbed. Meanwhile, thousands of American soldiers are landing on beaches in Normandy under withering fire, and the entire course of World War II is about to change. When Hitler finally wakes up and hears the news, he's not worried. He actually smiles. "Let them come," he says. "The Americans are soft. They've never faced real combat. My veterans will throw them back into the sea within days." 6 weeks later, Hitler is screaming at his generals, demanding to know how the Americans broke through defensive lines that were supposed to be impregnable. His contempt has turned to shock, and his confidence to desperation. This is the story of how Hitler's fatal underestimation of American soldiers cost Germany any chance of winning the war. And what happened on those beaches and in the fields of France will shatter everything you thought you knew about the American fighting man. Let's start with understanding what Hitler actually thought about Americans. This wasn't just a casual dismissal. It was a deliberate act. This was deep-seated contempt based on Nazi ideology and Hitler's own warped worldview. In Hitler's mind, America was a mongrel nation, a country of immigrants with no real culture or unity. He saw American society as decadent, corrupted by capitalism and democracy. He believed Americans were soft, spoiled by easy living and the abundance of goods. They had no warrior spirit, no discipline, no capacity for the kind of brutal warfare that Germany had perfected. Hitler examined America's performance in World War I and drew completely wrong conclusions. Yes, America entered late. Yes, American forces in 1917 and 1918 were initially inexperienced. But Hitler focused on the stumbles and ignored the results. He didn't realize that by 1918, American troops were fighting effectively and making significant contributions to the defeat of Germany. He saw what he wanted to see, which was evidence that Americans couldn't really fight. There was also a racial component to Hitler's thinking. Nazi ideology ranked races in a hierarchy, with Aryan Germans at the top. America, with its diverse population, was seen as racially impure. Hitler particularly dismissed the fighting capability of Black Americans, which was both racist and, as we'll see, completely wrong. He thought a mixed-race army couldn't have the cohesion and fighting spirit of a racially pure German force. This kind of thinking wasn't only morally wrong, but also strategically stupid, as it blinded him to reality. Hitler's generals largely shared these views, though some were more skeptical. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in Western Europe, reportedly stated that the Americans had good equipment but lacked the knowledge on how to utilize it. Erwin Rommel, who would command the forces defending Normandy, had more respect for American industrial power but still doubted the quality of American fighting. The entire German command structure went into the defense of France, assuming that American soldiers would be the weak link in the Allied invasion force. Now let's discuss what American soldiers were like in early 1944. The United States Army had indeed expanded rapidly. In 1939, the U.S. Army ranked 18th in the world with approximately 190,000 soldiers. By 1944, there were over 8 million men in the Army. That's a massive expansion in just 5 years. The Germans looked at this and assumed these soldiers must be poorly trained, inexperienced, and not ready for the brutal reality of combat against German veterans. But the Germans missed several crucial factors. First, American training was actually quite good. The U.S. military had learned from observing the early years of the war. They knew what modern combat looked like. They'd studied German tactics, learned from British and Soviet experiences, and developed training programs that prepared soldiers for the reality they'd face. Training camps across America were turning out soldiers who knew their weapons, understood tactics, and were physically fit. Second, by 1944, American forces were no longer completely inexperienced. They'd fought in North Africa against Rommel's Afrika Korps. They'd invaded Sicily and Italy. They'd learned hard lessons about combat against German forces and adapted. The troops landing at Normandy weren't all raw recruits. Many units had combat experience. Even the inexperienced units were led by officers and NCOs who knew what they were doing. Third, and this is crucial, American soldiers had something the Germans didn't fully appreciate: initiative and flexibility. The American military encouraged junior officers and even enlisted men to make decisions and adapt to changing situations. This was very different from the German system, which, despite its reputation for efficiency, was actually quite rigid in many ways. German soldiers were often excellent at executing orders, but less good at improvising when plans fell apart. Americans were taught to think critically and adapt quickly. Fourth, Americans had incredible firepower. The M1 Garand rifle that American infantry carried was semi-automatic, meaning it fired as fast as you could pull the trigger. German infantry mostly carried bolt-action rifles, which were slower. American squads had Browning automatic rifles providing squad-level automatic fire. American artillery was more numerous and better coordinated than German artillery. American soldiers could call in devastating fire support when needed. The Germans were about to learn that American firepower could make up for any lack of experience. Now let's get to D-Day itself. June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in history. 5 beaches, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers. The 2 American beaches are Utah and Omaha. Utah goes relatively well. The troops land in the wrong spot due to currents, but adapt quickly and push inland with lighter casualties than expected. Omaha is a nightmare. Omaha Beach is a killing ground. The preliminary bombardment has failed to knock out German defenses. The Germans have machine gun nests, artillery, and mortars, all positioned to create overlapping fields of fire on the beach. The first waves of Americans land and immediately come under devastating fire. Men are cut down before they even get out of the landing craft. The beach is chaos. Bodies everywhere. Equipment destroyed. Some units lose almost all their officers in the first minutes. For a while, it looks like the invasion might fail at Omaha. But here's where the German assessment of American soldiers proves catastrophically wrong. Despite the horror, despite the casualties, American soldiers on Omaha Beach don't break. Small groups of men, often led by sergeants or even privates because their officers are dead, start moving forward. They find weak points in the German defenses. They improvise. They use initiative. They fight their way off that beach meter by meter. By the end of the day, Omaha is secured. It costs nearly 2,500 casualties, but it's secured. Hitler hears about the invasion, and he's not worried. His defenses have inflicted heavy casualties. Some beaches encountered fierce and effective German resistance. He believes this is just the beginning, that the Americans will break against the Atlantic Wall and the invasion will fail. He tells his generals to prepare for a counterattack that will throw the Allies back into the sea. What he doesn't understand is that the Allies are pouring troops and supplies onto those beaches at an incredible rate. The beachhead is expanding. The American soldiers are learning and adapting with every hour. The fighting in the weeks after D-Day is brutal. The terrain in Normandy is characterized by bocage, which consists of hedgerows that divide every field. It's a defender's paradise. German forces use it brilliantly, setting up ambushes, falling back to new positions, making the Americans pay for every yard. But the Americans are learning. They're adapting their tactics. They're using their advantages in artillery and air support. And they're showing a tenacity that surprises the Germans. There's a perfect example of this in the fighting around Corinton, a crucial town that American forces need to capture to link up the Utah and Omaha beachheads. The 101st Airborne Division, which dropped behind enemy lines on D-Day, is tasked with taking the town. They face experienced German paratroopers who are dug in and determined to hold their ground. The fighting is house to house, street to street. The Americans take heavy casualties, but they keep coming. They use tanks to blast through defenses. They coordinate infantry and armor effectively. They eventually take the town despite fierce resistance. German commanders are starting to send worried reports back to headquarters. These Americans are not fighting like inexperienced troops. They're aggressive. They're well equipped. They adapt quickly. They don't panic under fire. And there are so many of them. The German forces in Normandy are outnumbered, and that gap is growing every day as more Allied troops land on the beaches. Hitler's response is to deny reality. He insists that the Americans are weak, that one good counterattack will collapse their lines. He's still believing his own propaganda. His generals try to tell him that the situation is serious, that American combat effectiveness is much higher than expected, but Hitler doesn't want to hear it. He starts blaming his commanders for not fighting hard enough, rather than accepting that his assessment of the enemy was wrong. By late June, the Americans had secured the Cotentin Peninsula and captured Cherbourg, a major port on the English Channel. This takes away one of Germany's key strategic advantages, which was the assumption that the Allies couldn't supply their armies without a port. The Americans have been supplying over the beaches using innovative artificial harbors, but now they have a real port. The logistics situation, which was supposed to be the Allies' weakness, is actually working better than the Germans thought possible. The breakout comes in late July with Operation Cobra. American forces, after weeks of grinding combat in the Hedgerows, have learned how to fight in this terrain. They've modified their tanks with special cutting devices that can smash through hedgerows. They've coordinated their tactics. They've built up an overwhelming force at a specific point in the German lines. On July 25th, they launched the attack. The assault begins with massive aerial bombardment. Over 1,500 heavy bombers, plus medium bombers and fighter bombers, pound a narrow strip of the German front line. Some bombs fall short and kill American soldiers, which is tragic, but the bombardment devastates German defenses. Then, American infantry and armor pour through the gap. The Germans try to hold, but they're overwhelmed. The breakthrough succeeds, and suddenly American armor is racing through the French countryside. This is where Hitler's underestimation of Americans really cost Germany. German forces had planned for a static defense. They expected the Americans to advance slowly, if at all. Instead, American tank columns are moving 20, 30, or 40 miles a day. Towns that were supposed to hold for weeks fall in hours. The entire German defensive strategy in France is collapsing because American forces are advancing faster than German commanders had anticipated. General George Patton's Third Army becomes operational in early August, and it quickly ramps across France. Patton's aggressive style was perfectly suited to the situation. His tanks are rolling at maximum speed. His soldiers are bypassing strong points and driving deep into the German rear. The Germans are completely off balance. They're trying to establish defensive lines, but by the time they set up, American forces have already blown past them. Hitler's response is catastrophic. Instead of ordering a retreat to defensible positions, he orders a counterattack. The Mortain offensive is supposed to cut through American lines and reach the coast, cutting off the forces that broke out. It's based on Hitler's assumption that American lines will collapse under pressure. But the Americans at Mortain hold. They're surrounded, but they fight back fiercely. American air power pounds the German forces. The counterattack fails, and now the German forces in France are trapped. The Falaise pocket becomes a killing ground. German forces are trapped in a pocket between American forces pushing from the south and British and Canadian forces moving from the north. Hitler initially refuses to authorize a retreat. By the time he finally does, it's too late for most of the German army in France. Tens of thousands of German soldiers are killed or captured. Equipment is destroyed. The German army in France is effectively wiped out. Let's talk about what American soldiers actually showed in these battles. First, incredible courage. The fighting in Normandy was brutal. Casualties were high, but American soldiers kept attacking. They didn't break. They didn't give up. When officers fell, sergeants took over. When sergeants fell, corporals or even privates took charge. The initiative and determination of American soldiers at all levels were remarkable. Second, adaptability. The Americans encountered tactical problems they hadn't anticipated. The Hedgerows, the difficulty of the terrain, the effectiveness of German defensive tactics. And they adapted. They modified their equipment. They changed their tactics. They learned from each battle. This ability to learn and adapt quickly is a crucial military skill, and Americans have consistently demonstrated that they possess it. Third, effective use of combined arms. American forces coordinated infantry, armor, artillery, and air power better than any army in history to that point. When American infantry encountered a strong point, they called in tanks for support. When tanks got stuck, infantry protected them. When ground forces needed help, they called in artillery or airstrikes. This coordination was practiced and perfected in Normandy, and it became devastating. Fourth, logistical excellence. We discussed the Red Ball Express in another video, but it's also relevant here. American soldiers were well supplied. They had enough ammunition, enough fuel, enough food. They could sustain high-tempo operations because their logistics were so good. German soldiers were often fighting on short rations with limited ammunition. That's a huge advantage for the Americans. Fifth, firepower. American units could generate incredible amounts of firepower. Every infantryman had a semi-automatic rifle. Squads had automatic weapons. Artillery was available in abundance. Close air support was common. When American units engaged in combat, they could bring overwhelming firepower to bear. This compensated for any tactical disadvantages and let them win through sheer weight of fire. Now, let's discuss specific units and soldiers who exemplify the actions that Americans demonstrated during the Normandy campaign. The 29th Infantry Division on Omaha Beach. These were mostly National Guard soldiers, not professional regulars. They landed in hell, and they fought their way off that beach despite appalling casualties. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, which dropped behind enemy lines on D-Day and fought for weeks surrounded by Germans. The 2nd Armored Division and other tank units made the breakout possible. The 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, demonstrated its effectiveness through its combat experience in North Africa. Individual soldiers, such as Audie Murphy, would become the most decorated American soldier of the war, like the Nyland brothers, whose story inspired Saving Private Ryan, like thousands of soldiers whose names we don't know, but who did their duty with courage and skill. These men demonstrated that American soldiers could fight and win against any adversary. The German commanders who faced Americans in Normandy came away with very different assessments than Hitler had. Rommel, before he was injured in an air attack, reported that American combat effectiveness was high and that German forces couldn't sustain the casualty rates they were taking. Other German commanders wrote about how impressed they were with American fighting quality after the war. The soldiers in the field knew the truth even if Hitler didn't want to accept it. Hitler's reaction to the disaster in France was to blame everyone but himself. He blamed his generals for not fighting hard enough. He blamed German soldiers for not showing enough spirit. He never acknowledged that his fundamental assessment of American soldiers was wrong. This inability to accept reality would characterize German strategy for the rest of the war. Hitler kept making decisions based on what he wanted to be true rather than what was actually true. The impact of Normandy went beyond just the campaign itself. American soldiers proved they could fight and win against the German army. This shattered German morale and confidence. It proved to the world that the United States had built a truly world-class military, and it gave American soldiers confidence in themselves. They'd faced the best the Germans had and won. That confidence would carry them through the rest of the war. Let's examine some of the myths and realities about American soldiers during World War II. The myth is that Americans won through numbers and equipment, while the Germans were better soldiers. The fact is more complex. Yes, Americans had numerical and material advantages, but they also showed genuine tactical and operational skill. They were innovative, adaptable, and brave. The idea that Germans were inherently better soldiers is false and often based on lingering Nazi propaganda. German soldiers had advantages. Many were experienced veterans. German officer training was excellent. Some German equipment was perfect. But German soldiers also had significant weaknesses. Their logistics were poor. Their tactical flexibility was limited. They were often fanatical, but fanaticism isn't the same as effectiveness. And by 1944, German forces were exhausted from years of war and couldn't replace losses effectively. American soldiers in Normandy showed that you don't need to be perfect to win. You need to be good enough and willing to learn. The Americans made mistakes. They took unnecessary casualties sometimes. Their tactics weren't always optimal. However, they learned from every battle and improved. That continuous improvement is what wins wars. There's also an important point about diversity. The American forces in Normandy comprised soldiers from diverse backgrounds, different ethnicities, various religions, and different regions across the country. Nazi ideology said this diversity was a weakness. Reality proved it was a strength. American soldiers fought together despite their differences. The diversity of perspective and experience made American forces more adaptable and resilient. The African American soldiers who served, often in segregated units, proved their courage and capability despite facing discrimination from their own military. The Japanese American soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, though they fought in Italy rather than Normandy, showed incredible bravery even though their families were in internment camps. The Native American code talkers played a crucial role in facilitating communication. All of these groups contributed to American success, and their contributions deserved far more recognition than they received. After Normandy, the pattern continued. American forces pushed across France, liberated Paris, and drove to the German border. They faced determined German resistance in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Hitler's last major offensive. The Germans achieved surprise and initial success. However, American soldiers held key positions such as Bastogne against overwhelming odds. They fought back and defeated the German offensive. Once again, American resilience and fighting quality proved decisive. By the spring of 1945, American forces were deep inside Germany. They'd crossed the Rhine, broken through the last German defenses, and were racing across the German heartland. German resistance was collapsing. The soldiers who Hitler said would be thrown back into the sea at Normandy were now in Germany's capital region. The dismissal had turned into a disaster. What can we learn from this story? First, never underestimate your opponents. Hitler's contempt for American soldiers was based on ideology and wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment. That's always a mistake. Whether in war, business, sports, or any competitive endeavor, you need to evaluate your opposition honestly. Assuming they're weak because you want them to be weak is a path to defeat. Second, adaptability matters more than initial advantage. In 1944, German forces had more experience and better defensive positions. However, American troops learned more quickly and adapted better. They took what they learned in each battle and applied it to the next one. The continuous improvement curve made them increasingly effective as the campaign went on. Third, don't believe your own propaganda. Hitler surrounded himself with yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear. He believed in Nazi racial theories that said Americans were inferior. When reality contradicted his beliefs, he rejected reality rather than changing his beliefs. That's how you lose wars. You need to be willing to accept uncomfortable truths and adjust accordingly. Fourth, morale and motivation matter, but they're not everything. German soldiers were often highly motivated, believing in their cause, willing to die for Hitler and Germany. American soldiers were more pragmatic, usually just wanting to do their job and go home. However, the Americans won because motivation without resources and a smart strategy isn't enough. You need the complete package. Fifth, diversity can be a strength rather than a weakness. The Nazi idea that racial purity created superior soldiers was completely wrong. American diversity brought different perspectives, different skills, and different approaches to problems. That made American forces more flexible and effective. Homogeneity creates blind spots. Diversity can compensate for them. The story of American soldiers in Normandy is ultimately a tale about the perils of making assumptions. Hitler assumed Americans were soft and weak. He thought they couldn't fight effectively. He believed his veterans would easily defeat them. Every one of those assumptions was wrong, and each wrong assumption made German defeat more certain. The American soldiers who landed on those beaches in Normandy weren't supermen. They were ordinary guys from ordinary backgrounds. Farmers and factory workers, high school graduates and college students, rich kids and poor kids. They came from every corner of America, representing every demographic. What they shared was decent training, good equipment, competent leadership, and the courage to do a hard job under terrible conditions. They proved that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they're given the tools and support they need. They proved that democracy can produce soldiers just as effective as any dictatorship. They proved that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. They proved that the American military, for all its flaws and imperfections, was capable of taking on and defeating the best the enemy had to offer. Hitler dismissed American soldiers as soft, weak, and incapable. He learned too late that he was catastrophically wrong. The beaches of Normandy were soaked with American blood, but American soldiers won those beaches, and then they went on to win the campaign, ultimately, the war. They did it not because they were naturally superior, but because they were well-trained, well-equipped, adaptable, and brave. Those are qualities that can be developed in any society that values them. The men who fought in Normandy deserve to be remembered not as mythical heroes, but as real people who did a tough job under the worst possible circumstances. They were scared. They made mistakes. They weren't perfect, but they got the job done. They defeated an enemy that underestimated them, and they helped save the world from tyranny. That's worth remembering. That's worth honoring. That's worth learning from. If this story changed how you think about World War II, if it gave you new respect for the American soldiers who fought in Normandy, if it showed you the danger of underestimating your opponents, then hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because we're bringing you the real stories, the human stories, the lessons that matter from the greatest conflict in history. Don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. That's what those soldiers on the beaches of Normandy showed us, and that's a lesson that never gets old.